2019, the average time spent in app by an adult in the US was about 3.5 hours a day. Today, that's over 5 hours a day. And so, I think there was a huge spike in time spent in app and engagement in apps during COVID. And behavior has shifted. People have come back to work. The world sort of resumed in many ways to what it used to be like. But a lot of the behaviors and habits that developed kind of remained.
Welcome back to another episode of Taking Inventory. This week, we welcome Brian Quinn, the President and GM of North America at AppsFlyer. Previously, he was the Managing Director at App Annie, a Senior Executive at Kenshoo, and really no one better to really speak about the topic we're going to dive into today, really getting into the app economy and the app ecosystem. And so, Brian, let's dive right in. Can you maybe tell our listeners a little bit about AppsFlyer, your role there, and why you guys are in such a unique position to really see everything that's going on around the app ecosystem?
Sure. Well, first off, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm about 5.5 years into AppsFlyer, and if you're not familiar, we are a technology company building tools and infrastructure to support mobile apps, developers and marketers. And so we're sort of known in the mobile attribution space, which is effectively helping marketing teams understand what are their marketing efforts, whether they be paid or owned, are driving installs and continuing engagement in mobile apps. That's sort of the primary reason we exist and the primary use case. Over the years, we've been at this for about 11 years. And once you're able to establish sort of attribution, there's a lot of other services you can build on top of that. You can protect advertisers from buying fraudulent installs. You can connect all the spend data into the same platform. We build deep linking services. So there's a lot of kind of tools, ancillary tools, engagement tools, measurement tools we build, but that's really the core business of AppsFlyer. We have a pretty significant global footprint. We operate in every major market. We have 20 offices around the world. We work with every category of apps. If you're a business, if you're an app developer and a marketing team that has chosen to work with an attribution provider, 65% of the time you've selected AppsFlyer. And so we have a pretty dominant market share in our space, and it gives us a good purview to understand globally some of the dynamics and trends that we see in the mobile app space.
And I guess in terms of like just those trends and maybe just like sort of the high level state of like the app economy, like where are we? We hear a ton obviously about the impacts of AT&T, and we've had Eric Suford on this podcast a few times, and we talk a lot about how like open web is dying, the whole world's moving to apps. So like sometimes you feel like the app ecosystem is like under attack, and at other times you feel like it's like just clearly winning. So what's your point of view of like where we are today?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It is sort of like under attack from multiple perspectives, and it's winning at the same time. It's just such a resilient ecosystem. You mentioned I was at App Annie. Before COVID, I spent a couple of years there, and I remember at that time, 2019, the average time spent in app by an adult in the US was about 3.5 hours a day. Today, that's over 5 hours a day. And so, I think there was a huge spike in time spent in app and engagement in apps during COVID, and behavior has shifted. People have come back to work. The world sort of resumed in many ways to what it used to be like, but a lot of the behaviors and habits that developed kind of remained. And it's amazing how much engagement we have as humans, as consumers, as users of, from entertainment and shopping and utilities. That's a lot of time every day. That's the average. And so, that just provides such a canvas for business growth, opportunity, innovation. And so no doubt there's, a lot of challenges. You mentioned AT&T, we're coming up on 4 years now since Apple announced iOS 14 and the introduction of AT&T, and highly disruptive for this entire industry. Really the first material change of what's known as signal loss in the mobile ad space. But at the same time, despite all those challenges, budgets are up, kind of on average, maybe 10% over last year. Um, UA dollars are up 21% year over year since last year. It's a pretty material jump. Um, Last year, I think there was 230 billion downloads, the most ever. And I think again, not to rattle off too many stats, but like it's hard to like fathom that there are outside of China there are two app stores and 5.7 million consumer apps. And I just wonder what other environment has two places to buy products and 5.7 million products. And you think about the discoverability challenges, how competitive that market is, yet how engaging it is to consumers. And it's just ripe for a lot of growth and challenges. So it's kind of under attack, but it's winning. And I think all of the above.
And with 5.7, I think you said 5.7 million apps. It is hard to comprehend that there's just this many applications in these two app stores. And I think in digital environments, like barriers have been broken down. So we're seeing a lot of like dollars flow from country to country. And it is kind of just one giant universe of apps. But like, how are apps like competing in such a saturated market today?
Yeah, I mean, I think while it's highly competitive, I think there's such a broad category of apps and so many different use cases and so much utility that it does provide room to fit into the sort of consumer, mind share. And I think that there's just, it's such an engaging medium still. It's such an intimate connection that we have, and the technology, the AI technology and apps, the AR, the VR, like all these kind of like new technology platforms. A lot of them we see in mobile apps first, and so I think the entertainment, the technology, it keeps engagement so strong that it just provides such a like a rich environment to innovate in. And so I think that despite it being super competitive, there's a lot of demand for it. And I think you see that show up differently in different global markets, right? So you see like emerging markets, Southeast Asia, India, countries where like a lot of people are starting, just getting their first smartphone. Data plans are getting very cost effective. So there's a lot of like new entrants, new app kind of consumers. And I think, you see, even in mature markets, you see like digital transformation really factor into sort of mobile. So like large companies that have existed for decades, way before the internet, they have lots of customers already, but they're recognizing that the data they can generate, the first party data they can generate through mobile engagement is very valuable to the business. And so there's a lot of strategies and there's a lot of new use cases and applications of like, traditional businesses that are still getting into mobile, with in earnest for the first time. So there's sort of like lots of innovation and ways to compete and a very large global market that sort of continues to grow.
And in these global markets, I haven't really thought about it before, but like as these new massive markets are sort of coming online and like the data plans are getting cheaper, is it almost always the case where like it's an app first economy? It's like, you get your smartphone and like, people are immediately kind of going to the app stores versus the browser. Is that like what the default behavior is? Kind of you've seen that like again and again.
I would say that's fair in emerging markets that didn't build out a lot of like web infrastructure. So the markets that I mentioned, yes, I think they're sort of mobile app first. A lot of these Asian markets have sort of like super apps, and everything that you do is through these kind of like main apps, and they're in the Western world, it's a collection of various different apps, from games and entertainment to networking and payments. And so a lot of your exploration of like the digital universe is through an app or through a handful of apps. And I think in more mature markets, US, UK, Western Europe, Brazil, you see more a split between mobile web and mobile app, right? So think about yourself. If you're buying plane tickets or booking hotels or even shopping online, if it's your first time with that particular brand, many of us are sort of on the web. We haven't like made that commitment yet. And after a couple of purchases or after I create an account, then the brand will try to get me into an app environment because I know I have a higher ARPU. I might, be a higher LTV customer over time, but there's friction there. And they want to make sure that I'm a customer first before I actually kind of go through that step. So I think the web versus app is more of a function of like the maturity of the market from a web infrastructure, side, if that makes sense.
No, that does make sense, and I think what we've talked about a lot on this podcast, that privacy changes are disrupting a lot of industries, none maybe greater than the app economy. So I want to get into that, but even before we do, since we're on the international front right now, like we're starting to see it. It looks like at least that every market is regulating a little differently and telling apps what data they can collect or can't collect or how they need to engage with users. I mean, we're seeing it in the UK. I think we've certainly seen it in Asia, in the US, and California. And so how are apps starting to navigate that? That seems really, really hard if you're not, as you said, like a conglomerate that is coming online for the first time. If you're like a single developer.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're right. It's there's a lot of legislation and regulatory bodies around the world sort of developing their own frameworks towards privacy, interpreting what privacy means for their own constituents differently. Makes it very difficult for global companies, multinational companies that have apps in multiple markets to contend with, no doubt. What we've seen, and certainly in the last like 3 or 4 years, this is really accelerated, is companies sort of creating and their own privacy frameworks and making it very clear to us and other technology companies that this is what we're willing to do. This is the philosophy we have with trying to gain consent for our users. This is a strategy we're going to take around that. There's a spectrum of different companies. You have some that are very, very brand conscious. There's a lot to lose in terms of brand equity. They're not going to push the limits at all. They're going to kind of look at maybe Apple's policies and try to abide by the spirit of them, and be very, very conservative when it comes to collection of data and the use of data. And they know they might sacrifice a bit of signal for marketing or targeting or optimization, but in their mind they may be sort of looking to kind of promote privacy and trust amongst their consumer brand, and they think ultimately this is how they're going to win. We see a completely other side of the spectrum where certain businesses are pushing the envelope, um, using all the data that exists, all the deterministic data that exists still, and trying to build models along that in anticipation of more signal loss. And it of course depends on sort of what markets you're serving. So generally speaking, we see the EU, UK, aggressively implementing these laws. In the US, we see more of a patchwork of different states. A lot of times what ends up happening is these businesses sort of have to comply with the most stringent of the geographies that they're in to be safe. But yeah, it's full-time work to kind of pay attention to this, and sort of like read the tea leaves and where things are going. And it makes for a lot of very dynamic, like a very dynamic situation for these businesses.
Earlier you're talking about how there's really these two main app stores, and you mentioned China. I assume you guys don't operate in China, but like, could you just explain maybe to listeners like how that market works? Is that an app driven marketplace as well, as far as you know?
We do operate in China. We actually have built technology specifically for the Chinese market to make sure that data resides in that market. It is app first. It was actually a big market for AppsFlyer. I think a lot of Chinese advertisers got a hold of our SDK in the early days, and they saw that as sort of a easy to implement, kind of put your credit card in and start capturing analytics early on. And there's a lot of innovation. It's a mobile first market, tremendous amounts of volume when you compare to sort of Western markets. And so It's a big app market. It's a big app market. It's a big market for AppsFlyer, no doubt. But I think it's interesting because they haven't had the lock of two, platforms or sort of walled gardens that have dictated distribution. And there's many stores. And I think it's an interesting market to look at if you think that there may be a proliferation of app stores outside of China, right? If you look at sort of what EU and other regulatory bodies are how they're looking at Apple and the potential of opening up third party app stores, that becomes very interesting. I think there's a lot of potential upside sort of back to the browser and outside of the two main app stores that we're familiar with. And I think China is like an interesting market to look at to understand dynamics that we may be facing in more Western markets in the future.
So, Brian, you've talked a lot about signal loss over the past several years and how these are being regulated in different markets. And so, what is the industry doing to combat that signal loss? Like, what are some of those signals that they're losing? But maybe what are some of the new emerging technologies to help combat that?
Yeah, there's I think when sort of iOS 14 was announced, there was some big questions around, what does it mean for the industry at large? Were companies disintermediated? What is it going to mean for Signal moving forward? How are we going to do sort of measurement and targeting? And I think, a number of things have happened since, for one, there's been sort of a lot of innovation around data clean rooms and data collaboration platforms. AppsFlyer has built one, but you see a lot of businesses, really innovating in this space, creating trusted environments for different companies to collaborate with one another without sharing their data between the two. So I think there could easily be a world where there's very little identifiers in the future, both on web and on mobile. Yet brands still have to collaborate. They still have to partner for growth. And so how are you going to do that? You need to be able to exchange signal, but have the data sort of reside in a trusted environment. So I think, this is one of the reasons you see a lot, of activity around clean rooms and for various applications, from measurement to enabling retail and commerce media buys and audience activation. So I think there's like a technology change at sort of an infrastructure level. I'd also say, in terms of signal loss, it's creating a lot of fragmentation for businesses. So you mentioned Apple and AT&T. At the end of the day, marketers need a single view of their marketing picture. They need a single source of truth. And iOS has got consented IDFA users. They've got non-consented data sets that probabilistic methodologies used for. You have APIs for Apple Search Ads. You have multiple flows of data on iOS alone. Once Sandbox for Android rolls out, you'll have kind of a similar set of fragmentation. All of that's got to be resolved in a single picture. It's got to be deduplicated. You have to have a realistic understanding of how all this is sort of coming together. And so there's a lot of technologies that are being developed to not just support those various flows, but to resolve that into a trusted single view of the business. If you think about it, finance has their view of a business. The game studios, the product teams have their view. So marketing's got to have a single view. So you see a lot of innovation on that side. And the last thing I'd say there's a lot of innovation in our space around signal management. So if you're familiar with attribution companies and referred to as sort of MMPs, prior to iOS 14, they were pretty similar in how they all operated with the walled gardens or the self-attributing networks. It was postbacks. Everyone had IDs. It was sort of matching IDs. You could determine attribution for an install. It was kind of, that's how it worked. It's changed pretty fundamentally now. We will be actually developing products and unique integrations with all these walled gardens. I know you guys were close to a lot of the folks at Snap, but what we did with Snap and with TikTok, we built an advanced integration where measurement is done deterministically and then effectively waterfalls to a probabilistic, privacy safe type of measurement methodology. And it gives a lot more credit to the marketing strategies that are driving engagement and installs from these publishers. And so there's a lot of co-development and deeper integrations in the space to try to give that visibility that signal loss took away, but be very privacy compliant and future proofed from further platform change and regulation. So just a couple of examples of the innovation around privacy.
And in terms of the collaborations like with the platforms themselves, what has the experience been like working directly with Apple? Like is Apple now like I guess like a good faith partner with the ecosystem? Can you tell what sort of your just like kind of take on like the role that they're playing right now as they start to launch new ad products and start to look more like a walled garden?
Yeah, I can't comment too much on our specific relationship with Apple. I will say that I think they obviously came out first with some material changes in the industry that, in a large part, has been very good for consumers. As much as it's caused a lot of disruption, sort of in the ad markets. A lot of that, I believe, has been recovered. You obviously saw the stock price of Meta and some others in the quarters after that, but a lot of that has been gained back. A lot AI has fueled a lot of that, but I really think they did in a lot of what they intended to do. They position themselves as sort of a privacy first, winning the privacy game from the device or the phone perspective. You see that from all their marketing and their billboards. And I think some of the policies that they've talked about, the privacy manifests and whatnot, it's given a lot more visibility to consumers, and it's raised the awareness even of developers of what data are we collecting, what purposes are we using it for. There's been a lot of data minimalization as a result of that, which I think is very good for the industry. I believe a lot of bad actors have been flushed out of the system, right? I mean, I think my opinion of this is, listen, most of the businesses, most of our customers, and most of our partners in the space of advertising technology, we were leveraging IDFA, Google Ad ID, cookies. We were doing so because they were available and they were easy to use, and everyone spoke that language. We were not trying to build rich profiles and monetize those profiles without users knowing it and doing these nefarious sort of use cases. That's not what most of the major players in the industry were doing. Those that were, I don't think, are operating like that anymore. And I think what Apple did was they effectively cleaned out a lot of the sort of nefarious aspects of our industry. And what you see now is a recognition that the way things are operating is actually quite good. It's quite good for consumers. It's quite good for businesses. So, I would say this when it comes to Apple.
I'm always curious. Like, I think we're in the industry, and so we recognize that these changes have been extremely disruptive over the last several years, and has helped usher in kind of a new evolution of what's happening. Um, but do you think consumers actually realize the change? Is there any material difference in their lives given all these changes that Apple has ushered in? And are you actually seeing that in the data of how they're interacting with apps or how they're behaving on their phones?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's hard to know from every corner of the world how consumer sentiment is changing and what it is. We try to put ourselves in different shoes, to kind of to think along those lines. I do think that in general, and not just because of Apple, but consumers are much more aware than they were several years ago about their data and the value of their data. I think that there's a more awareness of the exchange of that data, that I might give that up to a particular app or a brand, and I want something in return. So I think there's like a value exchange that's more in the consciousness than it had been before. Um, I look at even on my own behavior, but we look at like the web and how we're kind of accepting all when it comes to cookies and these like pop-ups that show up that you just want to get to your content, and there's sort of a um, I do wonder from a mobile perspective, like, will apps just sort of condition users to get to the content as quickly as possible, get to the experience, and not be so you know, decisive or conscious about like what we're opting into or what not. I mean, I think that's really like what we've seen on the web. But we have, from a data perspective, we track ATT opt-in rates, and we have a global footprint around that, and we've seen an increase year over year so far in 2024 of about 10% more. And you obviously know we need it on the publisher side and the advertiser side, but there's that it's nowhere like it was when that was a default setting. But we do see, more. The data does show us that there's more willingness to, opt into that equation. It's tough to know exactly why.
And is your assumption with that like app developers are just getting better at making that trade more valuable? Just users are starting to understand that like these experiences can be more personalized, or is it? Do you think and this obviously just kind of just your own point of view, or is it just like fatigue and they're just like screw it, I'll just do allow?
Yeah, hard to say. I bet it's a mix of both, and I bet that kind of varies more on the market and the app itself, right? I think I work with a lot of app developers who've been sort of studying the strategy of when to show the consent prompt, and they look at competitive apps, and they run tests, and they've really sort of put a lot of focus into like to doing that well, and they've taken their time and they didn't rush it. So I think there is intention and intentionality in that, and I do believe a lot of those consumers would recognize that they understand it's at what they're signing up for, what they're consenting into, what that value exchange is. And I bet there's a lot that the apathy is just kind of taking over. And maybe they've been saying yes or saying no, and they haven't really noticed a material change in advertising or any other experience. So what does it matter as a consumer if that's not what I'm thinking about day to day? So I can imagine it's a blend and even other factors.
Yeah, I mean, you opened up the conversation just explaining some of the stats of just the growth in the market. So clearly, that has not stopped consumers from downloading, engaging, from apps, spending on user acquisition, things of that nature.
Yeah.
But with mobile growing and continuing to grow and continuing to be kind of the center point of our digital lives, I think I'm curious to know, like, how are traditionally offline experiences or even new mediums kind of integrating into the mobile experience? And so some examples that come to mind for me are like CTV. I think our traditional, on big screen TV experience is now being brought to mobile devices and optimized for mobile. There's the Oculus and the Vision Pro, so like wearables now tying into mobile. And so, how are you guys seeing trends there, if you are seeing any at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's exciting because in one sense, the mobile device isn't new. Apps are not new relative to CTV media, and certainly, Vision Pro and Oculus and VR and AR platforms. But they still remain the most personal and intimate and kind of like at the core of these other experiences. Like they tie into the mobile experience pretty deeply. And from an advertising perspective, you can almost think about it since the advent of mobile apps, these new medias are bought and sold and measured many ways like the mobile industry created. Those methodologies, those technologies, like the supply chain in the industry, and a lot of that, like a lot of the performance measurement on CTV comes from the mobile measurement companies because they know how to do it best. And they know what the performance advertisers are looking for. They know how to present the data. They know how to get it. They have the attribution engines. We will change attribution windows. We'll think about real time versus not real time. We'll enrich data but at the end of the day, there's a reason why the mobile companies are the strongest measurement, for connected TV. You do have this confluence of sort of traditional linear TV buyers and agencies, and that's sort of crashing into the performance side. And I think like where that goes is still, I think a lot of folks are trying to figure out, right? And I think what that means to an advertiser is, from a mobile perspective, like what does CTV mean? Like where in the funnel is it? What is the strategy? Is it assisting a conversion somewhere else? Is that on a web? Is that on a mobile device? How much performance is it versus brand? Like, I think these are like big questions that the world is still sort of grappling with. But all of our many of our mobile advertisers, it's a big part of the conversation. It's a big part of the strategy. Um, I'd say, in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of demand for measurement capabilities across web, CTV, PCs, game consoles. And so even if you are a mobile developer, you're building an app, you're marketing an app, you are now, buying inventory on all these types of platforms, and you need to see the customer journey. You need to understand what's working based on an attribution methodology across all of these. So there's a lot of sort of innovation in this space. Not only the products work across these different platforms, but the marketing strategies all do as well. And a lot of it, it's got a very mobile app. In our world, very mobile app kind of base. That's ultimately the destination we're trying to drive towards. So this stuff does connect, in various ways.
And as it all evolves, and as AI is sort of being stitched into kind of everything, like how is that impacting kind of this ecosystem?
I guess what I'll first say is like what's so exciting is that this is obviously such a ripe environment for AI to have early gains in. There's so much data, the rate of data and the rate of conversions and the rate of impressions. It's so high at such a global scale, and I feel so many aspects of advertising, the copy, the creative, generative AI. These tools can take so much efficiency. So much efficiency gain for teams. Like, it doesn't have to be perfect. We're not, it's not medical, it's not legal. It kind of fits into the quadrant of like massive scale, massive efficiency, and it's marketing at the end of the day, right? So it's like we see a lot of our customers and a lot of marketing teams leveraging it internally for ad copy and creative generation. We see it across analysis. There's products in the market now that use computer vision to analyze the elements of a creative, separate out male versus female, red background, blue background, train in the background or a truck in the back. And at that level, what's performing best across all of your campaigns and ad networks. And that is something that just like wasn't being done before. Even the most sophisticated teams running creative in-house weren't at that level of precision, labeling different parts of a creative and then measuring it against a marketing outcome for that level of optimization. So, it's providing a real lift, I think, and a real, and a new signal. We talk about signal loss. This is a new signal to optimize creative. And I think it's a big area, just the generation and the optimization and analysis side. And I think the last thing I'd say to you is a lot of marketing teams are resources are hard to get, engineers are hard to get to build scripts, to write SQL queries, to build dashboards, and with these chat interfaces, that's no longer the case in every scenario, right? I mentioned earlier, you see these clean rooms. We wrapped our clean room with a chat GPT interface, and so now a marketer with not a lot of technical experience nor any resources can ask very basic business questions and get answers and be able to take action. And that wasn't there a year ago. And so now the adoption of some of these tools, the insights that business people can gain and have clarity of what's happening in their business it's incredible where we've come in 12 months. So I think these are just some of the few areas that like we see really taking hold when it comes to AI.
Yeah, I mean, it's cool to hear about a lot of these advancements that seem to be happening so quickly. And I think, if we look back over the last 2 decades or decade, really, mobile has led in so much of like of technology and what we're seeing in marketing and kind of pushing technology forward. And so as we look ahead, maybe, before we let you go, we like to look ahead and give you a little crystal ball and see, what does the app ecosystem, the app economy look like in 5 years even? I mean, at the pace that we're going now, what does this look like to you in five or so years?
Yeah, that seems like an eternity. I get always nervous thinking about.
Let's go 2 years then, 12 to 24 months.
I'll answer 5 months.
Yeah.
No, I mean I'm very bullish on this ecosystem, and I have been since I joined it. I just see it's so robust and it's so resilient. So I think it's a growing economy. I don't see any reason to believe that will change. I think a lot of the innovation we see, um, the apps are a ripe ground and asset for that for companies because the device is so engaging and so personal. So I think a lot of, tech, will find itself in apps, before the open web or on sites. I think cookie deprecation, to what extent, to when it comes, with Chrome, it'll disrupt a lot of web operations. And I think it's going to put more emphasis in businesses' mobile strategies. I think they're going to recognize that first party data from devices is really, really powerful and valuable. And third party data sets are, not the future for a lot of these companies. And I think it's going to create an opening, both in additional app stores, but sort of a cookieless world. The mobile companies have figured out how to operate without identifiers over the last 3 or 4 years. And I think that know-how, those tools, those methodologies are now going to apply when you can abstract, cookies and IDFAs, they never really computed. But when now you can run advanced measurement and analytics at an aggregated data set and have confidence in your models, now you can apply these to different data sets across different platforms. I think you'll see a lot of innovation spawning from mobile teams, mobile companies, on these other platforms. So I'm pretty bullish about it. I do wonder just if, like in terms of like user interfaces and software in general with kind of AI and how personalized that will get. But I'll save that for our next chat.
Yeah, we'll bring you back. In 5 months' time, see if those predictions came true, and then we'll look at 2 months from there. But Brian, thank you so much for joining us today and just giving us a lay of the land as far as apps go. Where can people learn more about AppsFlyer, what you guys do? And even before this, you mentioned you were a keynote speaker. I don't know if that's online and people can check that out.
Yeah, I did the keynote at MAU this year. It'll be on YouTube very shortly. AppsFlyer.com is the best place to find out about AppsFlyer. I'm happy to chat with folks, and you can find me on LinkedIn as easiest at Brian Quinn.
Awesome. Well, awesome. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, a lot of fun. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.